Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. And we have a very special show coming to you today, coming from Maui, the island of Maui, where I have just moved. And so it's a little bit, our situation is a little bit shaky right now, but we're going to have a great conversation because we're talking about something that's very close to my heart and something that's relevant to all of us. And that has to do with creating coincidences. And as our guest today points out, each of us has more to do with creating coincidences than we think. Today's guest says there's much more behind these occurrences than fate or randomness. Personal agency, individual thought and action play a crucial role in synchronicities and serendipities. Our guest today is Bernard Beitman, MD, author of the new book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Bernard is founding director of the Coincidence Project, which encourages people to tell each other their synchronicity and serendipity stories. He is the former chair of psychiatry at the University of Missouri-Columbia and has a private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia. His manual, Learning Psychotherapy, received 2 national awards for its unique interactive training program for psychiatric residents. He writes a blog for Psychology Today called Connecting with Coincidence. Bernard is internationally known for research in panic disorder and chest pain and has edited several books about how to integrate pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. Well, hello, Bernard, and welcome to the Pathway Show.
Thanks, Paulo. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, you have quite an academic portfolio and credits, and I'm just wondering how did you become particularly interested in the phenomenon of synchronicity, a phenomenon that you've now written your second book about?
Well, this second book is Meaningful Coincidence, as you mentioned, and its purpose is to serve as an organized description of meaningful coincidence. There's been a lot of different ways of thinking about them, as you know, Paul, and it's also to serve as a guide for using them in one's personal life. And that's what I'm trying to do. And why am I doing this? Because I thought it needed to be done, and I thought I could do it. And so I produced this book on meaningful coincidences. And how did I get into this? Having a lot of coincidences in one's life has a lot to do with what you're doing. I mean, our individual experience gets us to write stuff. I mean, people who write books are writing them from their own experience, whether they're novels or their textbooks. There's still something to them. And I just had a lot of them in my life. And you can read about the key ones involving my dog. He got lost. I got lost looking for him, and we found each other. And it was a dramatic story for me as an 8 or 9-year-old. And the other seed for this thing was like when I was about 31, I was choking uncontrollably and couldn't get something out of my throat. At the same time, 3,000 miles away, my father was bleeding into his own throat and choking and dying. So those 2 experiences, my dog and my father, are the seeds for my own experiences. But I've had lots of them, playing football, playing baseball, on the dance floor. I mean, they're all over the place. If you start looking for them, you see a lot of them. Right. And especially if you get open to them, then you'll be seeing a lot of them. So there's a lot of them going on, but I just I wasn't satisfied with the books that had been written and the conceptions that had been out there. And particularly problematic was, well, serendipity is the right thing to call it, and synchronicity is the right thing to call it. People argue sometimes about which one's the right one, but what they do is use serendipity for synchronicity and synchronicity for serendipity. So I tried to put them both under the term that covers both of them, which are meaningful coincidences.
But does serendipity always involve a coincidence? I would think serendipity might just be good luck, which is a coincidence, but
you know, this whole business, we use words like luck and quantum fields to cover our ignorance. Luck is when opportunity meets preparation is one of the early definitions of serendipity. Louis Pasteur said it. And I would add, not only luck is when opportunity meets preparation, but also when you are out there moving around looking for something. You have to be alert. And then you're prepared to see something, and then you're prepared to understand what it might mean, what the significance might mean. So many Nobel Prize laureates have stumbled across their ideas and made it sound like they had great science behind it. Luck is fun to talk about it, but I'd like to be able to break these things down into conceptual terms.
No, I appreciate that a lot. And you, I'm a big proponent of synchronicity and how to use it. I wrote a book about intuitive intelligence, which talks about how to leverage synchronicity. And it's exactly what you're saying. You have to notice it, and then you have to interpret it, and you have to, find the meaning, which basically, from my point of view, is a function of the intuition. It's like making these connections between things is an intuitive process. But I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a scientist, and you are. You represent the intersection between psychotherapy and synchronicity, which is fascinating, especially considering that Carl Jung, the great depth psychiatrist or psychologist, coined
psychiatrist.
He was a psychiatrist? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so he coined the term.
You're talking about his book. The only place he organized things about synchronicity was in a monograph that was pretty short. And it was a lot of the history of it and his theory about it. And his theory wasn't about, his theory was called synchronicity. And that, just to playing with the term, synchronicity was an acausal connecting principle. And Jung wanted to be able to explain how meaningful coincidences took place. And so he used the word synchronicity for how meaningful coincidence took place. So but as you are alluding to, Paul, he was a psychotherapist. We don't see much from him about how he used it in psychotherapy, except what I'm sure, is the most dramatic of his coincidences, involving the scarab and his patient who had a dream about a scarab. That's in my book too. I summarize it and take it apart because there's a lot to that story that doesn't get mentioned. But the person had a dream, and Jung was really frustrated. And it's important to remember that Jung wanted to break through the iron retort of her rationality. He wanted to. She wasn't intuitive. She wasn't tuned into her emotions. So he wanted to hit her over the head somehow, but that's not the way you do things. So he was waiting for an opportunity, and she had a dream of a golden scarab piece of jewelry. And as she was telling him the dream, there was a knock. There was a knock on a knock on his window, and that window was something that he thought maybe he should open. There was something. It reminds me of Santa Claus, knock, knock, knock on your window pane, because there it was. That was the present he was looking for. And I think I have some idea about what he knew what was out there, but that's another story. He went and got this beetle that was flying around in the Zurich area, and it was a rose Schaefer, it's called. They liked a lot of the roses at springtime, and he grabbed it and presented it to her and said, "Here's your scarab." And that blew her mind, apparently, at least blew her rationality, and she became more open to what he was talking about. I didn't explain any more about that, but I've written a post for Psychology Today about how synchronicity can be used in psychotherapy. It can be used to engage people into the psychotherapeutic relationship. It can be used to find patterns. It can be used for change. And given our time constraints, I suggest if anybody's interested, they can go to the Psychology Today post, also call my blog called Connecting with Coincidence, to see more about it. There's also good research now starting to come out about how synchronicity can aid the psychotherapeutic process.
Some people think that all coincidences are meaningful, as in the expression, there are no accidents. But that's not the way you look at it, is it?
There are no coincidences, maybe another thing that you might be saying, Paul. It's like there are a significant number of people who declared there are no coincidences. Well, what does that mean? To define a coincidence means the coming together of two apparently independent events in a surprising and unexpected way. Well, the implication of that is sometimes there could be an explanation, but you don't know what it is. So coincidences imply an explanation, because if you have the two events coming together and you know what happened, like how you and I are talking today, it's not a coincidence. I mean, you can call it that, but a coincidence is, I don't know how it happened kind of thing.
Right, right.
So if you have a cause for it, if you have an explanation for it, there's no coincidence. And what are the two favorite explanations for meaningful coincidences? God, universe, consciousness, quantum fields, among others, and randomness or chance. Each of those, God, the universe, fate, kismet, and randomness and chance, each suggest you have nothing to do with it. It happens by chance. It happens because it's been designed for you by fate, but there is no personal responsibility. So those two explanations say there are no coincidences because we know how they happen. God, randomness.
I see. Well, okay. Now, how do you know if a coincidence is meaningful? What makes a coincidence meaningful?
Well, if you are at all tuned into your intuition, you're going to get a sense for it. The highly rational person who's trying to figure things out only intellectually is going to have trouble with my book, as you could see in the person who rated my book, Meaningful Coincidences, gave me a 1 star. And if you read what this person wrote, she wanted a rational answer to how you know something's a coincidence that's worth paying attention to, how you know it's meaningful.
Right. Yeah.
And you got to like add your own personal something or other, because they have a personal quality that you got to pay attention to. And intuition, emotion, sense, I have a little button in my head that goes off when the coincidence takes place. Coincidence. I mean, I've gotten used to having them happen. So you can develop that capacity, but it's still done subconsciously. It's not done rationally.
And so some people are more sensitive to the perception of it, like yourself, for instance, because you've been paying attention and you've had you're open to it. And so you tend to notice the synchronicities that happen in your life.
You betcha.
And there's a lot of people who aren't sensitive to it because they don't want to consider the fact that anything that their rational scientific orientation can't explain is real. But what
spoken by somebody who knows? That's
So,
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So what about dreams? I mean, I have a friend who has dreams that are amazingly prophetic. Well, that's a coincidence, right? Is that a common arena for synchronicity?
Yeah. A lot of people have precognitive dreams, and synchronicity or meaningful coincidence is a connection between what's in your head and what's out there. So a precognitive dream is you dreamed it and there it was.
Right.
That's a meaningful coincidence.
So let's say that you're someone who is sensitive to this and you sense that there's a meaning to some coincidence that happened. You sense it's a synchronicity. How is that useful? How do you propose that's useful?
Well, I do try to go into that in my book, Meaningful Coincidence. It's a very important question.
Yeah.
How are they useful?
Yeah.
Meaning has two meanings, or meaningful has two meanings. One is, how is it useful to me and the people around me? And what does it tell me about how reality works? So there's an explanation meaning and there's a usefulness meaning. Coincidences can help us with decisions, help us soothe grief.
About 4 types of meaningful coincidences. Could you elucidate those for us?
Well, I wanted to continue that about
Okay.
how they are helpful, because that's really very important. We can do the types of them, but you asked me a critical question: is why should somebody pay attention to them? And they are personally useful in making decisions. They can soothe grief, and they can tighten connections, among many other things. And
Uh-huh.
they also can be, excuse me, but a lot of fun. I mean, it can just be something in itself, like a work of art, a wonderful thing to happen. Like a woman goes out at dawn, she's working late. She's just finished. She has a cup of coffee, and the sun is coming up, and she spills a cup of coffee as this glorious dawn is coming on her, and she looks, and she spilled the coffee in the shape of a heart.
That's great. I've had so many major synchronicities in my life. It's just, I'm so grateful for some of them. It's like one time I went to rent a house right at the beginning when I was developing the synchronicity software that I developed in 1988, and I needed to move, and I was a single father, and I went to this house, and the lady goes, "There's been 100 people have applied to lease this house." And I go, "Oh my God." And she goes, "But, tell me about you. What do you do?" And I go, "Well, I've started a little software company." And she goes, "What kind of software?" And I go, "Oh, it's for the Macintosh. It's a quirky little divination program." She goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "Well, it's the I Ching. It's called Synchronicity." She goes, "You did Synchronicity?" And I go, "You've heard of it?" And she goes, "Heard of it. It's the only software that I've ever bought." And she leased the house to me on the spot. And it became the house where I built the business, because it was a 5-bedroom house. And then later on Pathways, a couple of years later, John Gray was on the show, and he said, are you a radio guy? Is this what you do for a living? I go, "Oh, no. This is a labor of love. KBOO is community radio. This is just volunteer what I'm doing." And he goes, "Well, you're pretty good at it." He goes, "What do you do for a living?" I go, "Oh, I've got this quirky little software company." And the same thing happened. He said, "You did Synchronicity?" And I go, "You've heard of it?" He goes, "Oh yeah, Bonnie and I love it. We use it almost every day." So he and I have been close friends ever since. But it's so incredible how the universe, just when you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing, it just brings things to you in these apparently coincidental ways that are super meaningful.
I want to emphasize what you're saying, Paul. Uh, they help us. Coincidences, synchronicities, serendipities help us find our purpose in life. They help us find it and act it out and do it. And
Right.
that's one of the primary missions of my book, is to help people recognize that, yes, they can help with decisions, grief, and a lot of other things. But as you spread out your experience with them, they can help you find what your purpose here on this planet is, so that you can start helping others and connect with others to join together to help mitigate this environmental disaster and other disasters that we are creating for ourselves.
It's amazing, isn't it, how many times in life something that seemed like a living nightmare will turn out in hindsight to have been one of the best things that could have happened because of some connection that was made, or something that was let go of. But at the time, it was just not clear at all. You've invented a new term in this book, and I like it. And I want to ask you what it means. It's called simulpathy.
Simulpathy is what I call it, but simul is okay
Simulpathy.
too. Like
Yeah.
simultaneous, like simultaneous.
Okay.
Simulpathy is the feeling the pain of a loved one who is not not in the same place you are. The
Right.
person is at a distance from you. So this is like my father I mentioned with the choking, and he was choking and I was choking 3,000 miles away. That was my run-in with simulpathy. So I had to ask and look around. And my weird coincidence survey was a way of trying to ask people what kind of coincidences they have. And the weird coincidence survey told me that a lot of people sometimes experience the pain of or distress of a loved one at a distance. And I needed to confirm that. That's just the way I do things. So that and some other research suggested this is a real thing. And one of the fun ways of thinking about that it's a real thing, simulpathity used to be known in the 1880s, 1870s as telepathy.
Right.
Telepathy means tell is at a distance and pathy is feeling. But as you know, and everybody knows, it became much more about ideas and words and thoughts.
Right. How would you say that your book, Meaningful Coincidences, differs from many other books on synchronicity?
It's the right there in the title is the biggest difference. I'd like to find a book that has serendipity and synchronicity in the same book, because when people write about one or the other, it's usually just one or the other, not both of them together. So in that way, it's unique, but there's more to it than just that. It's like I've tried to do the anatomy of coincidences, try to talk about the type of the various types of coinciders, people who experience coincidences in different ways, try to talk about not just what help they are, but also to mention that not every synchronicity is so wonderful. There are problems sometimes associated with them. And then there is the problem of sometimes it's great at the beginning and awful later. Sometimes it's awful at the beginning and great later, as you were implying. Bad thing, good thing. There's a lot of variability in the quality for the person experiencing them that I wanted to be also to be able to say. And I wanted to develop a model that wasn't just quantum physics. I wasn't just God, universe, random. I wanted to be able to say how us human beings may have something to do with how coincidences like simulpathity take place. And then I suggest that we live in a mental atmosphere, the psychosphere, and we give and take energy and information from the psychosphere. And I'm still working on how this thing works, but I think it has something to do with the way simulpathity and precognitive things take place.
And another thing that you've been up to is you founded the Coincidence Project. Can you describe it and its mission for our audience?
The Coincidence Project is now a nonprofit in the state of Virginia, and its purpose is to its vision is to illuminate the invisible currents that connect and unite us. And part of what we're saying is the greatest thing that you can ever learn is to love and be loved in return, because we are connected and we need to be able to know how to manage those connections, and meaningful coincidences can help us to do that. In addition, we have several missions, and hearing your story with how you got that house rented to you is like a paradigmatic story. It's the kind of thing that we talk about and try to understand. What's important for us in the Coincidence Project is to encourage people like you, Paul, to tell your stories and then have other people tell the stories back to you. So it's a little bit like, or not just a little, a lot like dream circles that people in some Aboriginal cultures might do, who wake up at 3 a.m. in the Amazon, for example, and tell each other what they're dreaming. And this is what we're trying to do in something that we call the Coincidence Cafe.
The
Coincidence
I'm going to have to step in. I'm going to have to step in and do some sharing, but it sounds.
If I got your email and I can put you on the invite list.
Okay, I'll give it to you after we're done. And in fact, we're just about done now. We've only got another minute and a half before I have to close the show. So why don't we end our conversation by just inviting you to give our audience some advice around this topic, other than buying your book, which I'm going to tell them they should do. But what advice might you offer us?
We're in trouble, ladies and gentlemen, and a lot of people kind of know it, but kind of turn away from it. But we're destroying our habitat. And we're destroying each other. And that's part of all the confusion that we're creating with Gaia our earth spirit and ourselves, our human spirit, and the animals and plants that also are here. And we got to do something about it. And I'm saying that meaningful coincidences can help each of us find our purpose and find ways to connect with each other to help create a collective human organism that can, together as an organism, start turning things around.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Bernard, for being on the show. There's so much more we could explore. Unfortunately, it's a short show and we've run out of time. And I want to be sure to tell our listeners about your website, which is coincider.com. Coincider, COINCIDER.com. And I encourage them to go there and find out more about your work and more about Project Coincidence, etc. For those who may have tuned into Pathways late, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, author of Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. Now, don't worry, you can play or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with Dr. Bernard Beitman, psychiatrist and author of Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. And I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every other Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. And even better, podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com. That's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes, my YouTube channel, and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Bernard Beitman and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.